My key didn't fit the lock. I'd driven straight from my wife's grave to the lake house, the way Helen and I had driven up that gravel road 1,000 times in 42 years, and I put my key in the door of the cabin we built with our own hands, and it didn't turn. Somebody had changed the locks. While I was standing at my wife's headstone, somebody had changed the locks on the one place on this earth she loved most. I stood on that porch a long time, holding a key that no longer opened my own door. And then my phone buzzed. A text from my son-in-law, Doug. It said, "Sam, Karen and I are handling Helen's estate now. The lake house is family property. We'll box up your personal things and let you know when you can collect them. It's better this way." Family property. My personal things. As if 42 years of summers with things to be boxed up and collected. They were so sure the lake house was theirs to take that they never checked the one thing that would have told them the truth, and by the time they found out, they'd already humiliated themselves in front of half the lake. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Sam Reeves. I'm 68 years old. I spent 40 years as a union electrician, and I've been a quiet man my whole life. Not soft, quiet. There's a difference. And my son-in-law spent a whole season learning it the hard way. Let me tell you about that lake house, because you can't understand what they took until you understand what it was.
In 1983, Helen and I were young and broke, and we took a wrong turn on a drive and found Loon Lake. There was a half-acre lot for sale on the quiet end, cheap because the cabin on it was a falling-down wreck nobody wanted. Helen stood on that broken dock and looked at the water and said, "Sam, this is it. This is the place." We had almost no money. We bought it anyway. And for the next 10 years, I rebuilt that cabin one board at a time, slow and square, and to last. I put in the dock with my own hands. Helen planted the lilacs by the steps that still come up every May. It's where we taught our daughter, Karen, to swim, right off that dock. It's where we spent 42 summers, watching the water turn to copper at sunset, growing old together in the good, slow way. When the cancer came, the lake is where Helen wanted to be, and we'd sit on that dock wrapped in blankets and not say much, because after 42 years you don't need to. The last clear thing she asked me was that when her time came, I'd scatter her ashes on Loon Lake, off our dock, so she could rest in the one place she loved most. Her ashes were in a box on my mantle the day Doug changed the locks. Now I have to tell you about Karen and about Doug, because the daughter is the part that breaks something in a man that doesn't fully heal. Karen was our only child, and we loved her too easily. About 12 years ago, she married Doug Pruitt. Doug sold real estate. Doug was all handshake and teeth, the kind of man who looks over your shoulder while he shakes your hand. From the first, Doug looked at our lake house the way a butcher looks at a cow. He'd walk the property line instead of getting in the water. And once I heard him on my own dock saying, "Lakefront's going for $4.50 an acre up here now, and the old man's just sitting on it." The old man's just sitting on it. That's what our 42 summers were to Doug. Inventory. And Karen, God help me, had started to see it his way.
Helen passed on a gray morning in the fall, and in the weeks after, Doug and Karen were attentive in a way that should have warned me. They asked gently about Mom's estate, about whether I'd thought about what to do with the lake place since it's a lot to keep up alone. I thought they were being kind. At dinner one night, a month after the funeral, Doug slid a folder of comparable lakefront sales across the table and said, "Grief shouldn't cost you money, Sam." And Karen backed him. "It's just a building now, Dad," she said. "Sentiment is expensive." The dock where her mother taught her to swim? Just a building? 6 weeks after the funeral, I told them I was finally driving up to scatter Helen's ashes. I told them the date. I told them I'd be at the cemetery first, then drive up. I told them exactly when the house would be empty. And they used it. Because while I knelt at Helen's grave that afternoon, telling my wife I was finally taking her home to the water, Doug drove up to the lake with a locksmith and changed every lock on the cabin. The timing wasn't an accident. He knew where I'd be. He picked the one afternoon I'd be undone by grief and 100 miles away, and he took the house while I wasn't looking and sent me a text to find when I arrived. I want you to sit with that. That afternoon, I knelt in the wet grass at Helen's headstone and told her I was sorry it had taken me 6 weeks to find the strength. I told her I'd carry her down to the end of our dock the way she asked, and at that exact hour, 100 miles north, my son-in-law was drilling out the locks on the door of the place I'd just promised to bring her home to. He used my goodbye to my wife as the cover for his theft. People expect rage. What I felt, standing on that porch with the dead key in my hand, was a terrible clarity, cold and clean as lake water in April. 40 years as an electrician teaches you when everything goes dark, you don't panic. You find the break in the line. And I had a feeling that Doug Pruitt believed he could take this house, which meant something about who owned it. And I had a feeling he'd never actually checked. So I did what a quiet man does. I texted him back 2 words. Understood. Thanks. And I drove to a motel, and I sat on the bed with Helen's ashes beside me, because I wasn't going to leave her in the car. And I started, very quietly, to work the problem. I barely slept. I sat up in that cheap motel chair and I talked to Helen the way I had for 42 years, out loud. I said, "Helen, our girl let him take the lake." And in the quiet, I could almost hear what she'd say back, because I knew her that well. "Then you'd best go check the papers, Sam, because you never did read what you signed, and I always did." She was right. In 42 years, I'd swung the hammer, and Helen had read the fine print. And somewhere in that fact was the thing Doug had never bothered to check. The next morning, I drove down to see Gail Sutton. Gail had handled Helen's and my affairs for 15 years, a sharp, no-nonsense estate attorney with zero patience for nonsense. When I told her what happened, the locks, the text, family property, she took off her reading glasses and asked me one question. "Sam, when you and Helen bought that lake property in 1983, how was the title held? Whose names and how?" I told her the truth, that I wasn't sure of the legal words, but we'd bought it together, the two of us, like everything we ever owned. Gail smiled, a small, hard, satisfied smile. "Then I think your son-in-law just made a very expensive mistake." Here is what she explained to me in plain words.
When Helen and I bought that property, we'd held the title as joint tenants with right of survivorship. I didn't understand those words back then. We just signed where the lawyer pointed, but those turned out to be the most important words in this whole story. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship means that when one owner dies, the other owner doesn't inherit the dead one's share through any will. The property simply, automatically, instantly belongs entirely to the survivor. The moment Helen passed, that lake house became 100% mine the same day she died. It never entered her estate. There was no mom's share to inherit, because the instant Helen was gone, there were no shares at all. There was just me, and a title with my name on it, whole and clean. Doug and Karen had built their entire scheme on an assumption. They'd assumed that because it was Mom's place, it must be part of Mom's estate, and that Karen, as the only child, would inherit it. It was completely, totally wrong. They had changed the locks on a house that had belonged solely to me since the morning my wife died. And there was more. Helen had left a will, and in it my Helen, who knew our daughter and knew exactly what kind of man Doug was, had written one line I asked Gail to read to me twice. It said, "The lake house on Loon Lake is my husband Sam's, as it has always been, and it is my wish that it remain his for as long as he lives, and that my ashes be scattered there. I ask my daughter to honor this." She'd known. My wife had known what might happen, and she'd put it in writing, a wish and a warning both, and neither Doug nor Karen had bothered to read her mother's will, which said in plain English the opposite of everything they believed.
And there was one more thing, the thing that finished it for me. Along with the will, Gail had a sealed envelope Helen left, addressed to me, that Doug, as the self-appointed handler of the estate, had never passed along. In it, in Helen's shaky, late handwriting, she'd written, "My Sam, you will want to give in, to keep the peace, to keep Karen. Don't, not with the lake. That water is the truest thing we ever made together. Stand on our dock, my love. Stand there and don't move. And when you're ready, bring me home to the water. I'll be waiting." I read it 4 times. There was a night, I'll admit, when I almost let it all go, just to keep my daughter. That's what love does. It finds the soft spot and presses. But my wife had reached out of the grave to tell me to stand on our dock and not move, and I was not going to fail her. I told Gail to set it all in motion, quietly, and I told her I wanted to be there when they understood. While I'd been working the problem, Doug had been getting bold, because nothing makes a man careless like a win he thinks is already in the bank. I found out from Earl, who's had the cabin 2 docks down for 30 years. Doug had already had a realtor up, walking the lot with a clipboard. He was telling the whole lake he and Karen had taken over Helen's estate, and it was worse than I thought. Doug had a developer on the hook, a company buying up the quiet end of the lake, and they'd put a number on the table. $1.6 million for our half-acre and the cabin, with the cabin to be torn down. Doug had verbally accepted. There was a closing date 3 weeks out. He was going to let a bulldozer push the dock where Helen's ashes were meant to rest into the lake for a percentage. That was the night the last of my hesitation burned off. I asked Earl to call me the next time Doug came up, and 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, he did. Doug and Karen were at the lake house with a realtor and an actual for sale sign they were about to stake at the end of the dock, and a small moving crew to start hauling Helen's and my things out to a trailer. They were going to empty 42 years of our life and stick a sign in the lawn, all in one Saturday, certain the old man was beaten. I was not beaten. I was 20 minutes out, with Gail Sutton in the passenger seat, a folder on her lap, and a locksmith following in his own truck. We pulled up that gravel road, and there was my cabin, with a stranger's crew carrying my wife's chairs out the front door, and a realtor staking a for sale sign at the head of the dock, and Doug directing it all in his good polo shirt like he owned the world. He saw my truck and walked over, all teeth. "Sam, look, I know this is hard, but it's happening. Don't make a scene in front of people. You should go." I didn't raise my voice. I have never once needed to raise my voice. I said, "Doug, before you put that sign in the ground, I brought somebody who'd like to show you a couple of papers." And Gail Sutton got out of the truck. She opened her folder on the hood, calm as Sunday, and started laying documents down, one at a time, the way you deal cards to a man about to lose everything he bet. First, the title. Mr. and Mrs. Reeves held as joint tenants with right of survivorship since 1983. Mr. Pruitt, do you understand what survivorship means? It means that the moment Helen Reeves passed away, this entire property became the sole legal possession of her husband. It never entered her estate. There is nothing for your wife to have inherited, and nothing here for you to sell. I watched the color drain out of Doug's face. I watched the realtor slowly lower the sign she'd been about to drive into the ground. Then Gail laid down Helen's will and read that line out loud, in front of the moving crew and the realtor and Earl, who'd wandered over to watch. "The lake house on Loon Lake is my husband Sam's, as it has always been. I ask my daughter to honor this." She looked up. "Did either of you read this before you changed the locks?" The silence on that dock was the loudest thing I've ever heard. And Doug, who always had a play, found his mouth and found nothing in it, because there is no clever version of "we changed the locks on a house we never owned and tried to sell it out from under the man who does." He tried anyway. He said Karen was the daughter, of course the lake house came to her. And Gail said evenly that being someone's child does not make you the owner of property that legally transferred to a surviving spouse. Then the realtor cleared her throat, said her brokerage could not list a property whose seller had no title to it, walked the for sale sign back to her car, and shut the trunk. That one solid thunk was the sound of Doug's $1,600,000 driving away. And then I looked at my daughter. "Karen," I said, "you learned to swim off that dock. Your mother held you up in the water until you weren't scared. She picked the chairs those men are carrying out of our house, and 6 weeks after we buried her, you let this man change the locks on her lake while I was standing at her grave, trying to find the courage to bring her home to that water." I had to stop a moment. "I came up here to scatter your mother, and I found you selling the place she asked to rest." Karen started to cry. I don't know to this day if it was shame or just the sound of a plan collapsing.
"I didn't have them arrested. I could have. I chose not to, because she's still Helen's girl. I had the movers carry every stick of furniture back into the cabin. I had my locksmith change every lock in the daylight in front of all of them, and I put the new key in my own pocket, and I watched Doug Pruitt drive away from a deal he'd been so sure of. That was 3 months ago. Karen and I are not what we were, and maybe we never will be. Doug doesn't come up to the lake anymore. Word travels on a small lake, and the story of the real estate man who tried to sell a dead woman's cabin out from under her grieving husband and got caught doing it on the dock in front of everyone traveled fast. Doug lost the listing, lost the commission he'd already spent in his head, and lost the one thing a salesman can't easily get back up here, which is a single soul on Loon Lake willing to shake his hand. The for sale sign went in my burn barrel, and I watched it burn with a cup of coffee and no regret at all. And last Sunday, finally, on a still gold evening with the water flat as glass, I walked out to the end of the dock I built with my own hands 40 years ago, the dock where my daughter learned to swim, the dock they'd nearly staked a sign into, and I opened the box and I brought Helen home to Loon Lake the way she asked. The water took her gentle. Earl stood back by the lilacs and let me have it alone. And I stood there a long time after, not moving, just like she'd told me to. Doug thought a lake house is something you take. He never understood it's something you build, 40 summers at a time, with the one person who knew which lake was home. They changed the locks while I stood at my wife's grave. They never checked the one thing that mattered. The house was already mine. It had been mine since the morning she died. And so, it turned out, was the lake, and the last word, and her.